For good reasons, quite a few scientists who deal with the history of social movements today consider Marcuse as one of the fathers of social movements. His book, One-Dimensional Man, published in Germany in 1967, was of outstanding importance for the democratic and cultural awakening of the 1960s. His critique of a technocratically administered world opened the view for alternative political practices, for ideas of self-determination and democratic participation, ideas that decisively influenced the student movement at that time. The late 60s were the time when many new neighborhood groups, citizens' initiatives, aid associations, and other political organizations pushing for autonomy came into being. Also, Medico International, the organization I have worked for over 40 years, was founded at that time. Concerned citizens in Frankfurt, alarmed by the war in Vietnam, began to organize medical aid. It is interesting to observe how a spontaneous initiative of that time developed into a globally active NGO. I could tell about this a lot, but I have another issue to talk about. Oskar Negd and Alexander Kluge formulated the understanding of politics that emerged in the 1960s in this way, and I quote them. It is a process in which people try to realize their everyday utopias and make new experiences in dealing with each other. They are forms of real ownership, the restructuring of perceptions, and the sensual probing of a social space that had been expropriated from people's everyday experiences. Revolution would therefore rather be understood as a sum of citizens' initiatives, a merging structure of civil disobedience, than as a class action in the old sense. This is probably the understanding of revolution appropriate to modern societies. The hope associated with this political approach were high, the hopes were high, and they still are, despite all justified skepticism, and that is what I'm going to talk about. Since the 1960s, civil society engagement has increased enormously. Today, independent initiatives are pushing for social and environmental improvements all over the world. They see themselves as a voice of the socially marginalized. They fight for equal rights for all, for peace and disarmament. They provide humanitarian aid and other social services. Quite a few are transnationally networked, such as the Small Farmers Movement, Via Campesina, or health groups gathered in the People's Health Movement. In contrast to the often spontaneous initiatives of social movements, NGOs have a permanent and fixed internal structure, usually regulated by national association law. Most of them entered to the political arena only in recent decades. The number can hardly be determined. A few years ago, there was an estimation of 50 to 100,000 NGOs worldwide. Today, more than 20,000 are considered to act globally, and almost 5,000 have a consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. In comparison, in 1968 were only 180. NGOs have its roots in different settings and times. Some emerged from the labor movement in the 19th century, others have their origin in religious communities and churches. Most of today's NGOs, however, arise as a reaction to the enormous political transformation that came about in the context of the neoliberal globalization. As we know, the globalization, as it happens, was first and foremost an economic and not a political project. Quite the reverse. The global unleashing of capitalism had weakened the international political system, the UN and its institutions to shape conditions heading for a better life for all. Due to the deregulation of the cooperative sector, nation-states lost the capability to deal with increasing transnational problems such as climate change, arms trade, or tax evasion. NGOs have stepped into this gap. They pushed for public control and rational shaping of those world politics which more and more became governed by a rather obscure network of some powerful states and multinational corporations, leading to what we have to witness today, the loss of hegemony, a new confrontation of powerful blocs. Though, and this is quite important, the increasing of civil society engagement in the past decades is also due to the failure of representative democracy. Better, to an increasing lack of political legitimacy. This sounds a bit paradoxical, since civil society engagement is usually seen as an expression of democratic gain. I will come to this back later. But let us first stay with the practice of social movements, which show an astonishing dynamic. There are times when they fill the headlines only to be pronounced dead sometimes later. A few years ago, the environmental movement of the 80s and 90s seemed to be exhausted, and suddenly, without any prediction, the Fridays for Future took the streets again. The reason for this up and down are complex. They include both internal and external circumstances. I will briefly outline one of them four altogether. First, the scope of social movements is usually limited to one issue. This gives social movements an enormous strength that can unleash a huge power, but there is a lack of a comprehensive concept of society, which Marcuse, not least, considered necessary for all forms of self-organization. If we look around today, we can discover a great variety of initiatives that are striving for change. They run cooperatives, they claim for tax justice, support refugees, fight for climate protection, against arms trade, and so on and so on. This is all okay and important. However, it suffers from the fact that all these activities are not related to each other and thus cannot see themselves as a part of a common push for social transformation. The lack of such a comprehensive concept of society does not mean that social movements cannot succeed. Sometimes it's precisely the focus on one issue that gives the commitment strength and public credibility. It's always connected to public and what the public is expecting from the actors to do. With the pressure developed by social movements in the 1990s, international regulation that as a Biodiversity Convention, the Statute of the International Criminal Court, or the the prohibition of landmines could not be reached. Second, but what comes after success? And what happens if it takes too long? What is if future generations might set other priorities? Social change does not happen overnight. Changes require persisting power that might be able to cope with temporary defeats, and quite often takes more than one generation. Third, co-option and/or repression. Despite to the 1990s, when states were surprised by the power of civil society engagement, remember, this was a time when the internet came up, which provided all these initiatives new forms of mobilization. Today's states have learned their lesson. They have found new ways to co-opting civil engagement, and where this is not possible, of fighting it with repression. Again, we are confronted with ambivalent circumstances. On the one hand, new formats of participation have become an integral part of democratic legitimacy in some places. On the other hand, we observe an increasing defamation of civil disobedience as an act of terrorism, and that almost all over the world. And finally, professionalization. This is a difficult word. And this brings me to NGOs. One important reason for the declining of social movements has always been their professionalization. The expertise that the social development movements develop from the critique of conditions is almost automatically pushing for the formation of professional organizations for NGOs. The fact that most of today's NGOs have their origin in social movements explains the huge variety of NGOs. There are highly powerful NGO multinationals like Greenpeace, Save the Children, or Oxfam. There are smaller ones, aid and human rights organizations that develop out of the solidarity movement, such as Medico International. There are independent research institutes, as the Wuppertal Institute in Germany. I'm sure that in all other countries you will meet them also. And there are privately organized social services, such as the counseling centers for victims of torture. Not to forget, of course, the church-related relief organizations and other faith-based organizations. And there are thousands of so-called Southern NGOs, also colorful Porto Alegre people, as it is sometimes called, many of whom are again working with internationally active NGOs and are still firmly anchored in social movements. There is an interesting point. Due to the high credibility that NGOs enjoy in the public, at least in the past decades, also semi-governmental NGOs, Wangos, quasi-NGOs emerged, sometimes even created by governments, the government-created NGOs. And most ridiculous, some business organization and automobile clubs also claim to be NGOs. But there is no doubt, without the work of NGOs, the state of the world would be much worse. With their willingness to stand by others, NGOs defend the deeply human capacity for solidarity, and that is not small in times of social fragmentation. However, the prefix non-governmental does not always mean a radical opposition to prevailing power relations. Many NGOs seek proximity to governments. And this is one of the most important reasons why NGOs can be part of the solution, but they also can be part of the problem. They can undermine power relations, but also stabilize them. They can strengthen powerful critical positions through their expertise and thus put pressure on governments alongside social movements. They can help people with alternative ideas to speak out on the political stage. They can contribute to overcoming civil wars, as it was the case in Mozambique in the 90s, or even force the resignation of governments, as Pakistani lawyers succeeded in doing a few years ago. However, they can also contribute to the stabilizing of prevailing conditions by just making necessary repair to the state and thus contributing to overcome the deficits in political legitimacy. I have occasionally commented on this by saying that the privatization of state was accompanied by a kind of state-making of NGOs, with a huge difference, of course. Yes, private or aid organizations, for instance, they can act less bureaucratically than social authorities, but they can never provide the guarantee for universal social security as public institutions at least are supposed to do. Against public institutions, people in need can claim legal entitlements, but they can not do it against private initiatives, such as the Tafeln in Germany, or recently established internet platforms like GoFundMe. Don't know whether you've heard about this. It's interesting to have a look at their websites. The opportunities for participation offered by civil society actors today is both. It's a gain in democracy in terms of self-organization, and it's a loss, namely if those in need ultimately become beggars again. This development has fostered a worrying kind of what I call refeudalization. And if you don't agree with this, just have a look at the enormous power of the Gates Foundation, running almost half of the budget of the WHO, an international organization, but responsible only to the funders themselves, to Bill and Melinda Gates. There are quite a lot of dangers that result from these circumstances for NGOs. I will briefly describe them. Co-optation. In the course of what I have called the state-making of NGOs, many NGOs have lost their initial independence. Demonstrators who were anchored in social protest movements have become experts who sometimes differ neither in habitus nor in dress from government representatives. Many NGOs have allowed themselves to be co-opted only by carrying out repairs to the systems today. They have become actors of an extended state, as Gramsci put it, and have been taken into service as such. Loss of legitimacy. Together with the loss of their roots in the social movements, NGOs run the risk to also lose their legitimacy. In all the years in which I have participated in international conferences, I have repeatedly met NGO representatives who claim to speak for the marginalized of this world without being in contact with them. Loss of utopian in pragmatism. The bureaucratization of the world hasn't stopped at the doors of NGOs. Also, social change can never organize in the same way as the production of commodities. Today, even NGOs consider business-oriented management as a proof of professionalization. Nothing against a precise planning. But what does it mean if the goals of a project are to be measurable, timely, realistic, and scheduled, as demanded by relevant management training courses such as the SMART criteria? Do such orientations really help in fight against the causes of crisis, against structural poverty, against unjust relations of power and domination, against a dictator which is never scheduled, be able to be scheduled, but measurable? The danger that lies in pragmatic or this kind of management action is its depolitization. Next, economization. In Germany, we have this word, it's a difficult word, for Betriebswirtschaftlichung. I don't know whether you have a translation for this in English. NGOs do not exist outside the capitalistic societies. They too are subjects of economic constraints. They have to pay salaries and to secure budgets, constraints that increase with the size of organizations and can ultimately ensure that political goals step back behind those of economy. This could be the case, for instance, when NGOs compete for access to donations and public funding. Complex projects, such as the creation of fair trade relations, are less easy to sell than emotionally charged action, such as the saving of whales. The currency that counts in today's highly emotionalized public is narrowness and credibility, and both is easier to generate with small projects, with human touch, than with political demands. Persisting post-colonial attitudes. Particularly the work of development-oriented NGOs needs to be analyzed in the context of post-colonial attitudes that their representatives quite often are not aware of. However, if NGOs seek for creating small business as a solution to poverty, if they promote microloans and help to switch the poor into entrepreneurs, they contribute to the finalization of poverty, to the capitalization of the world. To put it bluntly, such approaches are no longer aiming on social change, but rather of adapting people to destructive conditions that have imposed on them from outside. Finally, there are the multi-stakeholder meeting approach, which is cultivated almost everywhere today. The idea is simple and sounds convincing. All who are affected by political decisions, and in this case have a stake, are supposed to participate in decision-making. Not only governments, but also representatives from the business, from civil society, so the theory goes. In practice, however, the partners who came together are highly unequal. Powerful corporations, frequently represented by highly paid law firms, politicians who may express sympathy for human rights, but following economic dictates, point to constraints, influential philanthro-capitalists such as the Gates Foundation, and finally a few civil society actors who are supposed to give the whole thing a participatory appearance. The experiences that I could make with multi-stakeholder meetings weren't just motivating. Even if participants agreed to the need of substantial changes in principle, the results were dominated by practical constraints, promoting a kind of instrumental reason, in other words, to keep it up. You can see the results after all these conferences. But there are winners. The cooperative sector. While in former times the cooperative sector had to use background conversations when trying to influence policy making, they are now sitting completely open at the table. The naive idea of being able to resolve problems through voluntary cooperation between highly diverse actors, between, to put it bluntly, perpetrators and victims, has opened the door for a dystopia of corporate governance that becomes more and more reality today. So is it all crap? Definitely not. There is still hope for change, to push for self-determination. Revolution should be still understood as a sum of citizens' initiatives, as emerging structure of civil disobedience, as Nagt und Kluge put it. However, the struggle for self-determination must be accompanied by activities striving for public institutions that secure and enable self-determination. The fundamental contradiction between individual and society cannot be resolved just by cutting off society. It is the balance between self-determination and social security provided by social institutions, public institutions, that needs to be found. Necessary is an emancipation of both the individual and the society. Since the idea of self-responsible is also at the center of the neoliberal ideology today, focusing only on the individual can lead into a dangerous trap. You have heard about this neoliberal credo. If everyone thinks themselves, everybody is thought of. Fostered by Maggie Thatcher's, there is no such a thing as society. By making the demand of self-responsibility its own, capitalism has quite been successful in dismantling social institutions and public welfare. For wealthy people, the idea of self-responsibility may mean an increase in freedom. For less privileged, who are dependent on social security systems, it is rather the opposite. A kind of Vogelfreiheit, as we call it in Germany, a kind of outlawness. In what Nancy Fraser once called progressive neoliberalism, the question of how to counter the growing social insecurity has been given far too little attention. The consequences are worrying. All over the world, we have to observe social exclusions, a dramatic increase of social insecurity, one of the main drivers for anti-democratic tendencies today. Without the containment of capitalism, democracy can never be developed, not even defended. But to whom I'm saying this, Marcuse said nothing else, and he has also referred to another fact that is causing trouble today, the fact that domination can also be embedded in people themselves. The persistence with which the prevailing conditions have been able to survive, in spite to all criticism, also lies in the fact that people identifying themselves with these conditions, more precisely with the conditions of capitalist societies. The result is not adaptation, says Marcuse, but mimesis, an immediate identification of the individual with its society and thereby with society as a whole. Theoretical capitalism has long been disproved. Not least the current crisis leave no doubt that it has reached its limits. But the majority of people have deeply internalized its principles. Economic growth and competition are still seen as having no alternative. Unrestrained consumption of goods as an expression of freedom, and even the actors of civil society are not protected from such identifications. So let me conclude with some short remarks on the way forward. NGOs, as I said, are on the crossroads today. They are either part of the problem or part of the solution, especially when they remember their roots in social movements. NGOs can still powerfully challenge injustice and domination. It is therefore no coincidence that ruling powers today fight civil society engagements worldwide, that democratic space is shrinking worldwide. Only 12% of the world's population lives in countries where people can speak their minds, assemble and protest against injustice largely unhindered. In 116 out of 196 states, basic civil and political rights are massively restricted, while civil society actors in the global south are much more affected by such restrictions. Threats to democracy are also increasing in Europe and in the US. The fight against growing authoritarianism has become a central challenge for civil society actors, and although NGOs have to play a part in it. They can produce knowledge about the drivers of right-wing development. They can get involved in educational work and demand measures to effectively combat social insecurity, political combat. And there is no lack of resources to make everyone's lives socially just. The world is literally swimming in money. However, due to a misguided tax policy, it is just not where it is needed. Long ago, it would have been possible to introduce a global basic income, as well as a global social security fund, which would give everyone, everywhere in the world, regardless to the purchasing power, access to adequate social infrastructure. The radicalism of such approaches may not lie in one of these demands, but bundled in a strategic concept, condensed in a comprehensive vision of an emancipated society, they can unfold the power needed to get social change. And perhaps this is the way out of the crisis, a new understanding of globalization based on solidarity from below. What speaks against turning the idea of the UN Economic and Social Council of which I spoke at the beginning, from its head to its feet. For instance, in trying to organize small gatherings on a local level when people get together and discuss what is needed for democratization of their living environments. Could be done when people from the environmental movement and the other movements, the labor movement, the social movements, get together and start to communicate and to discover and fill this democratic space, which is important to get up with new opinions. Many things must change in human dignity. It is many things must change if human dignity is to apply for everyone. The relationship to nature, the relation between sexes, the distribution of socially necessary work, consumer habits, in other words, the entire way of life. Strategically, the way leads from below to above, from local to global gatherings. Democracy, and this is my end, flourishes on counterpower, and this in a double sense. A strong, self-aware public sphere is needed to enforce democratic procedures and institutions, but it is also needed to watch that institutions created in this way do not become part of a bureaucratically administered world again. The goal is to create an emancipated society, running institutions, enable all people everywhere in the world to shape their lives in a self-determined way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. You brought it on the point. It's a dilemma between the individual emancipation and the emancipation of the society in these times. And if you have questions, please feel free to ask. We have 5 minutes for taking questions.
Thank you. No, I like the idea that you put. I was thinking in terms of Marcuse, how NGOs could be repressive, the sublimation of the social movements, because you said those limitations, but another part that I would like to hear more about your research is about the function of the state in this situation, because it's difficult to still think if you go in a state that we have the welfare state and so on and so on. But if you go to a country that the state is not a concrete experience, for example, like Brazil, or the experience of an state that you are disconstructed, and you see the role of the NGOs to make a kind of fragmentation of the politics, the policies. I was thinking how we can make the state as a self-government too, because I believe that Marcuse is dual in the sense. There is this kind of community, like you said, but I believe that there is another Marcuse that said we need to march on the institutions too. We need to create a counter-technical, counter-education to create a new society inside of these big institutions. So how you think about the question of the state, that's a word that appeared in the beginning of your exposition, but disappeared after that?
That's a good point, and of course I was talking about NGOs much more than about states. I'm not promoting to keep with the state as it is. What we are calling for is a kind of socialization of states, to change states into organizations, and therefore I was speaking about public institutions, not state institutions, that are serving for people, for the public. But these institutions are needed. And my problem is that in the past we haven't given much attention on this need to consider and to try to get a vision of what kind these how these public institutions can be organized. But you're right, this is precisely what we have to do. I'm not sure whether I can answer your question by this. But, I can give you an example. For instance, if we are talking about health security, people start, and this is what I was referring to, GoFundMe, which is an internet platform, which is sometimes presented as a digital security system. It is very easy. People who are in need, like, can tell their stories, put it to the internet, and ask for funding, for money. Sounds very narrow, very practical, and very self. But the problem is, what do we do with people who are not able to present their story, their needs, who don't want to do it, who have cases to present which is not very good for them? There's a need for a kind of institution which is giving more a more abstract approach, which is more anonymous, let's say. This cannot be organized by people themselves. You need public institutions for that, and they have to be very huge. If we all together decide to create an insurance system for our own, only if one person of us is getting seriously ill, we have to stop it. It's only possible within groups who are much healthier, with no huge social difference, to gap these differences. There is a need for institutions, and we don't have them today. If we look at the global level, and we have to look at the global level, and this is what I missed to explain. We are looking for, I just gave two examples. The global basic income is one of the issues I would like to promote, and what I call sometimes a globale Bürgerversicherung, a global health fund, for instance, or a social fund, which is providing, trying to balance the differences between the health resources available to people in the different countries. Yeah. But there is a lot to do in this context.
One last question, short question. We're running out of time.
I didn't get you.
Elon Musk is sort of his own NGO. What do you, I mean?
Are you really asking for that?
I'm just curious. I mean, you mentioned
Gates, yeah.
the Bill Gates. So
yeah, I think this is just another person, Elon Musk, but he's much more stupid. Bill Gates is, I think, is much smarter, and Elon Musk, I have no idea. He is the kind of person who is so powerful, but tomorrow he can decide to shift to the next issue. It's not possible to count on him. The only way is to dismantle his power, and this can be done by a different kind of tax system, by a different kind of organizing or preventing people from getting such richness. There's another organization which is needed.